Time is precious, and so are our pets. So time with our pets is extra precious. That's why we started Dutch. Dutch provides 24/7 access to licensed vets, with unlimited virtual visits and follow-ups for up to 5 pets. You can message a vet at any time and schedule a video visit the same day. Our vets can even prescribe medication for many ailments, and shipping is always free. With Dutch, you'll get more time with your pets and year-round peace of mind when it comes to their vet care.
Ryan Reynolds here from Mint Mobile. I don't know if you knew this, but anyone can get the same premium wireless for $15 a month plan that I've been enjoying. It's not just for celebrities. So do like I did and have one of your assistants switch you to Mint Mobile today. I'm told it's super easy to do at mintmobile.com/switch.
Upfront payment of $45 for 3-month plan, equivalent to $15 per month required. Intro rate first 3 months only, then full price plan options available. Taxes and fees extra. See full terms at mintmobile.com.
Hi everyone, a warm welcome to you all. Laszlo Montgomery here with another exciting episode of the China History Podcast, as advertised last time and hundreds of times before that, you can be sure. Maybe it's because of the people I mostly hang out with, or because I'm so familiar with the subject, but I thought the term paper son was generally understood out there in our American discourse, at least. I didn't expect the history to be general knowledge or anything, but I thought most informed people had at least heard this term before. So when I was having a conversation with someone over dinner not too long ago, I was inwardly quite surprised that this person had never heard that term paper son. They weren't Chinese American or even Asian, but still, they were someone quite educated and well-traveled and had been to China. But they had gone more than 45 years in this country without ever having heard that term. So I made a mental note to up the priority on this topic, and that's why it's being featured today. I'm going to mainly talk about paper sons and the Chinese confession program. The confession program is another slender volume off the bookshelf of American history that's not too terribly well known and kind of serves as a final chapter to the whole Chinese exclusion era. In this election year of 2024, the matter of undocumented immigrants is a front and center issue. The government has had, by anyone's reckoning, plenty of time to sort this matter out to everyone's equal dissatisfaction. Yet here we are, 2024, Year of the Dragon, still hotly debating immigration reform in the U.S. Congress and in state houses across this great land. And by the time this episode is over, I hope you can all see that this issue went way back, even before all of our lifetimes. In more than a few past CHP episodes, we looked at that post-California gold rush and railroad era in the 1870s and 80s that led to such drastic action being taken by the U.S. government. And we've explored all that history, as well as some of the names of the unsung heroes of that age, such as Wong Chin-fu, episode 136. Gold was discovered at Sutter's Mill January 24th, 1848, and what followed was a 34-year period where hundreds of thousands of Chinese, mostly Hoisanese and from 5 other surrounding counties, came here, worked hard, saved, and either they went back to China or they stayed right where they were in the U.S. of A. to make a go at it, just like so many European settlers and immigrants had done before them. And though the U.S. Congress will later in 2012 express regret for the passage of the Chinese Exclusion Acts, the congressman back then still went ahead and passed this legislation anyway that adversely affected people of Chinese origin in the United States because of their ethnicity. 1882, Chinese exclusion. 1892, the Gary Act. And 1902, Chinese exclusion was made permanent. And our friendly neighbor to the north, and Canada too, they hopped on the Chinese exclusion bandwagon and passed their own restrictive laws in 1885 and 1923, including the issuance of CI certificates. CI meant Certificate of Identity. They were used to track Chinese who had to carry these papers on their person during the term of these Canadian Chinese Immigration Acts. And while we're on that subject, The Chinese-Canadian Museum, located in the Wing Sang building in Vancouver's Chinatown, 52 East Pender Street. Well, there's an exhibition that looks back on the centenary of the passing of the Chinese Immigration Act of 1923, a.k.a. the Chinese Exclusion Act in Canada. It features hundreds of these CI certificates or identity documents, the most ever publicly displayed in a single exhibition. So that exhibition is running until the end of 2024. So if you find yourself in Van City, go check it out. Back in the U.S., these exclusion laws lasted from 1882 to 1943. But remember, leading up to 1882, there was quite a ramp-up period where Chinese exclusion might just as well have been in effect. And if China hadn't been our ally in World War II, it's likely these laws would have lasted beyond 1943. Sometimes even law-abiding Chinese born in the USA face scrutiny, harassment, and the specter of deportation, especially come the 1950s. I'll get to that in a bit. Yeah, no question about it, no matter which pair of glasses you put on. When we look back on those years, we know in our 21st century mindsets, it was a racist thing to do, and it left an embarrassing stain on the American brand. But America's Chinese, they did what they had to do to survive and thrive. Actually, it didn't really matter if they had gone to the Caribbean, South America, Europe, or even to the great port cities of Southeast Asia. To varying degrees, they were often not made to feel welcome wherever they went. And at the same time, like many an immigrant before and after, well, they were willing to work longer, harder, and smarter. And their success in their new land was met with local resentment, and we all know the rest of that familiar story. But on April 18th, 1906, 5:12 in the morning, San Francisco and the entire Bay Area got hit with a magnitude 7.9 earthquake. A portion of the San Andreas Fault that ran between San Benito County in the south to Humboldt County in the north slipped a little, and with that came this devastating geological disaster. Fires raged for 4 days before the rains put them out. 500 city blocks, 4 square miles in the city center, where 28,000 buildings stood, all leveled. As bad as this natural disaster was, from crisis came opportunities. There was urban rebuilding, innovations, and codes for how structures could be built in the future. The entire transport network was able to be redesigned with a sense of order and efficiency. And let's face it, there's money in rebuilding ravaged cities from the ground up. And for the undocumented Chinese living in the area, it also presented a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. It'd be 70 more years in the future before Shugart Associates came out with the 5.25-inch floppy disk, so there was no backup of anything. All records were destroyed. Births, deaths, marriages, property, the whole kit and caboodle. As soon as the smoke cleared, a Chinese man born in Hoisan with no right to citizenship, if interrogated, well, he could now claim he was an American citizen. If he was ordered to produce proof of citizenship, well, all he had to do was say it was destroyed in the fire and file a writ of habeas corpus in the nearest district court. He only needed to find one single witness to testify under oath that he was who he said he was and that he was born here in these United States. The courts, law enforcement, and immigration authorities, they had nothing. All the city records that might possibly prove or disprove this person's claim to birthright were incinerated in the fire. It was his word against the courts. 8 years prior to the quake in 1898, well, there was a ruling in a landmark Supreme Court case, U.S. versus Wong Kim Ark. I won't go into the details, but the court ruled that if a Chinese or anyone was born in the USA, they held U.S. citizenship based on the 14th Amendment to the Constitution that passed a year after the Civil War ended in June 1866. It said it right there, front and center. All persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States and of the state wherein they reside. no state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges or immunities of citizens of the United States, nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, nor deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws. Yeah, it said what it said, and the U.S. Supreme Court ruled in favor of Wong Kim Ark. If you're born here, you're a citizen. Enough said. Equal protection under the law, right to due process, habeas corpus, rules of evidence. You were entitled to the whole package. Now any Chinese immigrant, with the assistance of counsel, all they had to do was jump through the necessary amount of hoops and swear on the Bible that they were born in this country, the U.S. of A. Born here. That was the key. You had to have been born on U.S. soil, not naturalized. That pathway didn't exist for them until 1943. You know how it is. Right up there with freedom of speech was another one of those things in the American genetic code: due process and equal protection under the law. If a man or woman stood before a judge and swore an oath declaring they were born in the U.S., the court couldn't accuse them of lying. There was no documentary proof to deny their claim. He or she may have been lying, but in San Francisco, the largest center of Chinese immigration in the country, the fates had allowed a very unique dynamic to unfold. Not only were they granted citizenship, their children were eligible too. And not just their children. Aside from their own children by birth already in the country, a secret door also opened whereby one could claim that someone who wasn't actually their son or daughter by birth, but presently in China, was planning to return home to America. Well, this may have been true. It wasn't uncommon for Chinese American immigrants to send their toddlers back to their home village to get that operating system installed properly. And when the child was older, they might return to America. So this was a common thing. Again, the slate had been wiped clean, and there were no documents that could disprove any of these fraudulent claims to citizenship, nor the particulars of their family. Post-earthquake, after the last of the fires had been put out, individuals and families were able to sort out their residency and citizenship with the authorities. At that time, if they chose to, they could tell the authorities, they still had a child or children in China who were born in the USA. The government couldn't call them a liar. No records existed that could disprove anything. And as the city rose up from the ashes during the final years of Theodore Roosevelt, McKinley, and Taft, record-keeping was reestablished that helped to restore some order as far as the citizenry and the population went. Moving forward, this would mitigate the number of false claims to citizenship. It staunched the flow. But enough horses had managed to escape from that open barn door as a result of the earthquake. And from that point forward, these citizens, some real, many not, claimed they had children in China who were born in the U.S. but had gone back to be raised in their ancestral village and were returning to the U.S. to come live with them. And these children were called derivative citizens. Same thing. Who was to say if this father's claim was true or false? Some were actually legit, but those who weren't were called paper sons. The idea was, if someone in China, most likely from Hoisan, if they wanted to send their child to the U.S., well, he could contact a broker of sorts who kept tabs on who had available slots, as they were called, and the broker would match this prospective immigrant up with a Chinese immigrant in the Bay Area, someone who now held citizenship thanks to, a legal or fraudulent claim, and who also had rights to a slot they created by claiming he had a U.S.-born son who was back in the old country. And these slots were bought and sold on the open market to someone in China who wanted to immigrate to America or send one of his kids there. So let's say a man in Hoisan, he buys one of these slots for his 15-year-old son. The boy would sail to San Francisco and be taken to Angel Island, which opened for business in 1910 and had become a notorious house of interrogation and detention. And the immigration officer handling the case would examine the boy's documents that purported he was born in the U.S. and that his parents were also born in the U.S. And the 15-year-old lad, well, he knew these papers he carried and the information contained on them were false. The father's name written on the document wasn't his real father, nor was it even the surname he was born with. And the immigration officer, yeah, he too, he knew. Everyone knew, and no matter how loudly the authorities stamped their feet or shook their fist, that's the way the system worked in America. Again, this was a paper son, an illegal immigrant who, through the purchase of documents obtained through a middleman or broker, adopted the legal identity of a legal Chinese American who himself may have obtained citizenship fraudulently. Well, after a while, the numbers just didn't add up. Based on rough statistics prior to the earthquake, if all these claims of citizenship by birthright were true, well, each Chinese woman present in San Francisco before the earthquake would have had to have given birth to hundreds of children. It's no problem for a seahorse, but not easy for humans. The record for most kids given birth to belongs to a Ugandan mother who gave birth to 44 children across 15 births from 1993 to 2016. So this many Chinese women, all giving birth to more than 100 kids? Come on, bukanung. But the U.S. government was stymied, confounded, and constantly on its back foot trying to get ahead of the situation. And all throughout the Wilson, Harding, and Coolidge years and the lead up to World War II, the government played an endless game of cat and mouse, trying to trip the Chinese up. Innocent or guilty, all Chinese, no matter what, were viewed with suspicion. The immigrants would be forced to walk through a Kafkaesque maze of probing questions, each one designed to reveal a contradictory response or anything that had a bit of a bad smell. Illegal immigrants, where I live, well, that term's usually reserved for Mexican or other people from Central or South America. But in American history, the OGs were the Chinese. They got to be the first. So the battles they fought in the U.S. courts and on the streets of all the Chinatowns across the country had a direct impact on all future immigrants who found themselves in similar circumstances. They were the trailblazers who, like over 1 million residents of Los Angeles today, mastered the arts of hiding in plain sight, living in the shadows, always careful not to create a scene or be caught near one. Arrest and deportation was always a sword of Damocles hanging over their head all the time. And so these legendary stories have been told and retold about the lengths these paper sons had to go through at Angel Island in order to survive this grilling before they were granted admittance to the Golden Door. Because of the dynamic that existed with the earthquake happening in the American city with the largest Chinese immigrant population, the Chinese were able to create and manipulate a system of illegal entry into the country that was built on top of a false paper trail derived from the very efforts of Uncle Sam to enforce Chinese exclusion. Thanks to so many Chinese Americans who have written stories and recorded oral histories, we have a very vivid picture of what went on inside Angel Island and what it was like to go through that formidable gauntlet. We're left with so many stories of prospective paper sons memorizing the details of their identity and the invented kinship that was now their family. Even valid citizens in Chinese with authentic documents, stressed out getting tripped up over some technicality or trick question. The entire ethnicity, documents or no documents, lived under a cloud of suspicion. Once a paper son survived the Angel Island ordeal, all they had to do for the rest of their life was remain vigilant in public at all times and to be prepared for the randomness of life. All decisions one made were made through the prism of risk of exposure or, worst case, deportation. Even into old age, many paper sons never spoke about this, even to their own children. It happens sometimes that someone under intense interrogation might reveal one lie that might cascade into a whole row of dominoes falling that might lead to them. like all immigrants holding jiazhi, or false papers, they learned to live with the anxiety and stress and to adopt a low-risk lifestyle. The least risky path was never to leave Chinatown unless necessary. This wasn't true in all cases. For many who avoided sneaking across the border from Canada or Mexico, the long game was to become a paper son and to play it cool, build up and enhance their false identity, and ultimately return to China. Not everyone was looking to spend the rest of their days in the U.S., but many also went to their graves here, keeping this secret. There's more than one way to look at all this. Chinese exclusion, which all reasonable people agree in our day was repugnant, made legal immigration virtually impossible. So in a way, making a mockery of the system and going about it in the way the paper sons and daughters and their enablers did, it was perfectly justified.
Time is precious, and so are our pets. So time with our pets is extra precious. That's why we started Dutch. Dutch provides 24/7 access to licensed vets, with unlimited virtual visits and follow-ups for up to 5 pets. You can message a vet at any time and schedule a video visit the same day. Our vets can even prescribe medication for many ailments, and shipping is always free. With Dutch, you'll get more time with your pets and year-round peace of mind when it comes to their vet care.
Ryan Reynolds here from Mint Mobile. I don't know if you knew this, but anyone can get the same premium wireless for $15 a month plan that I've been enjoying. It's not just for celebrities. So do like I did and have one of your assistants switch you to Mint Mobile today. I'm told it's super easy to do at mintmobile.com/switch.
Upfront payment of $45 for 3-month plan, equivalent to $15 per month required. Intro rate first 3 months only, then full price plan options available. Taxes and fees extra. See full terms at mintmobile.com.
Some might argue the earthquake of Mao Zedong's triumph in 1949 rivaled the San Francisco earthquake in magnitude. The communist victory over the nationalists led directly to a spike in demand for U.S. immigration and really put a lot of stress on the U.S. Immigration and Naturalization Service. The exclusion laws had been repealed in 1943, but immigration was limited to 105 Chinese per year. So, out of the frying pan and into the microwave. Well, by the 1950s, with the victory of the communists and the lead up to McCarthyism, there were some elements in the U.S. government who were already seeing a hardened Maoist behind every bush from Hoboken to San Diego. Well, word began to spread around certain circles that there was this fifth column that existed inside the United States, mostly consisting of Chinese immigrants who infiltrated here during the 1950s. And these Chinese immigrants were being secretly controlled by Chairman Mao, and they were bent on the overthrow of the government, not to mention truth, justice, and the American way. And the figure from this time who rose to the fore to sort this all out and find out the extent of the damage was Everett F. Drumright. He was a longtime public servant who served as the U.S. consul in Hong Kong during the height of the Cold War years. In 1945, he had been named chief of the U.S. Division of Chinese Affairs. He was the one who set up the U.S. Embassy in Seoul, South Korea, and also served in India. And later in 1958, Eisenhower named him ambassador to the Republic of China. As the Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Far Eastern Affairs, he produced a white paper that was submitted to the State Department that put things in motion that ultimately led to the Chinese Confession Program. Drumright purported that this rampant immigration fraud perpetrated by the Chinese, both in Hong Kong and in the USA, was being used by Mao and the communists to infiltrate the U.S. and cause us whatever grief they were capable of doling out. There wasn't a whole heck of a lot of evidence produced that corroborated Drumright's assertions, but again, you have to pop 1950s lenses in your frames and relook at this from that prescription. If you think Americans hate communism now, back then, the fear and loathing was at a raging, frothy boil. So something like the Drumright report, coming from someone as respectable and experienced as Everett Drumright, carried a certain amount of heft. Exclusion had already been over for a decade when Drumright's report came out, but some of the inferences, the language, and rhetoric sort of harken back to those late 19th century times when the pejoratives and debasing comments were a common occurrence in the press and in American society. Mere suspicion was enough to quash any application for citizenship. Legitimate applications were getting mixed in with the riffraff. The government found themselves in an impossible pickle. How to separate the good from the bad, how to separate the loyal and sincere from the malignant, and how to untangle this impossible knot that got inadvertently created via a combination of Chinese exclusion and the great San Francisco earthquake. In the end, there was no simple way, and raising the bar to an impossible height that kept out the good immigrants also wasn't a viable option. Back in those days, Chinese American organizations were aghast at how their community was being singled out like it was. The story of how Qian Xue's son got hounded out of the United States has been told in a 2-part CHP episode. By early 1957, the mood was looking pretty ugly. And just as some Chinese Americans today suffered blowback from the sour state of U.S.-China relations, so it was back in the 50s in the wake of Mao's victory, the Korean War, and now the fires of McCarthyism. Even though Boston lawyer Joseph Welch on June 9, 1954 had already uttered the immortal words to McCarthy, "Have you no sense of decency?" Well, the damage was done, and the radioactive fallout remained palpable. In March 1957, the New York and San Francisco CCBAs, Chinese Consolidated Benevolent Associations, held an extraordinary meeting. There were CCBAs all over the U.S., but these two in particular acted as the lobbying organization back then who tried to get the Chinese a square deal. 124 delegates from 34 cities attended this meeting. Eisenhower sent a representative to the convention, and immigration reform was the main topic. They met and gave their recommendations to the government. I know the U.S. isn't the only country with immigration challenges facing them every hour of the day, but what's important to keep in mind, this isn't some 21st century hot-button issue. Chinese immigration became an issue almost as soon as they began arriving here, fresh off the farms of Hoisan in the mid-19th century. By the 1950s, the government had to admit, the whole matter of paper sons had made monkeys out of them all. No one was going around saying this, but they'd have been better off never having passed Chinese exclusion, which turned out to be the mother of all the paper sons. But now, with Chairman Mao, the communists, all the hysteria whipped up by the Drumright Report, well, they couldn't screw around anymore. They had to sort this whole matter out and move forward on clean footing. But before they went ahead and did that, there was one last attempt made to weed out the leftists, suspected communists, and whatever deplorables lurked amongst the Chinese American community. The Chinese confession program was meant to be the fork in the road, where the government would wave its magic wand and offer citizenship or a pathway to citizenship for all paper sons and other undocumented Chinese immigrants. In theory, at least, by doing this, establishing this new benchmark, it negated the need to keep wailing on the Chinese immigrants, forcing them to endure the most aggressive interrogation techniques short of physical abuse. With the successful implementation of this program, there would no longer be any need to force the Chinese to comply with these extraordinary forms, demanding impossible to procure information, and playing this age-old game that rarely ever produced a winner. By this time, 1957, the U.S. consul in Hong Kong might grant a visa to a Chinese applicant, and as soon as they arrived on the West Coast, they'd have to go through the same process again and be sent back. There was no order. It was a travesty. Too many good and decent citizens were squawking to their political representatives about this whole thing. So following the Drumright Report, the INS, Department of State, and Justice, they all put their heads together and came up with this program, and it ran till 1965. The kernel of the Chinese confession program called for any paper son, paper daughter, or paper family to come forward and confess about their identity and that they had basically lived a trouble-free past and didn't go carrying pictures of Chairman Mao. And if all was good, they could get a green card and ultimately citizenship under their real identity. No more living in fear of La Migra pouncing on them. But there was one catch, one quid pro quo. Part of the deal was you had to rat out your friends, family, and colleagues. Who can forget the immortal words Robert De Niro's character said to a young Ray Liotta in Goodfellas? Never rat on your friends and always keep your mouth shut. That's what a lot of people chose to do. Trust the U.S. government? Boy, some friend they had been to their citizens of Chinese descent. But you see, the way it worked was, with all the anonymous tips and tidbits that got revealed during these interviews, it was like a stack of Jenga blocks. You never knew who was going to crack under pressure and cause a cascade of confessions that might implicate someone not interested to take the government up on its offer. Some Chinese who got hauled in under an anonymous tip might opt to stick to their story at first, but when they came back a second time, they had their attorney present and they confessed. There was a whole procedure that had to be followed. The first order of business when a paper son decided to come forward was to confess that their citizenship was acquired by fraudulent means. Then they had to reveal their true name and the true names of everyone in their family and their whereabouts. And just within single families, there was often a difference of opinion about the wisdom of taking the government up on this offer. There were families who were bitterly divided on the issue, so you could imagine some of the stress it put on many. They had to come clean on any crimes committed, convictions, had they ever voted in an election or served in the U.S. military, and most important, did they belong to any communist organizations, such as the Communist Party of the USA, which, by 1957, more than 10% of the members were FBI informants. Then they had to surrender all false identity documents. They were required to write down the following words on their passport. Quote, "I hereby surrender my passport." End quote. And then they had to express their willingness to be deported. Then they had to either apply for a suspension of deportation and shoot for either permanent resident alien status or citizenship, depending on their case and eligibility. Then nothing to do except kick back and wait for the INS to rule on the matter. If you had an unsavory background and were mixed up in communist or leftist organizations, you got deported. This number wasn't big. Most people survived the ordeal. Between 1957 and 1965, 11,336 Chinese confessed and implicated another 19,124 Chinese. The confession program, it worked for some, but not for all. Through the collected confessions made, more than 5,000 slots reserved for future paper sons were eliminated. And that pretty much put an end to that history. The Chinese confession program divided the Chinese American community. After so many decades of having been pushed around by various government agencies, many felt it was foolish to acknowledge their illegal status, betray their friends and relatives, and there was no guarantee from the government that in coming forward and confessing that this would secure their right to remain in the U.S. The confession program ended with the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965, also known as the Hart-Celler Act. America's Chinese immigrants, after more than 8 decades, finally caught a break. All the quotas and roadblocks that singled them out unfairly went away. And as opponents to the act fared, it led to an explosion of immigration from all over the world. And here we are, 60 years later, still a flaming hot topic, and not just in the land of the free. So the history of Chinese immigration, exclusion, unfair legislation that targeted them specifically, and all the tortured history of the 19th and 20th centuries, it all makes for very interesting reading and reflection. Like I said, many have come forward and told their stories. The history of the paper sons and the Chinese confession program, just a couple chapters from a Chinese American chronicle that includes some of the most remarkable success stories achieved by any immigrant group that ever came to these shores, who not only contributed to the greatness of America, but in some cases to the greater world as well, and leaving a trail of achievements, all the while bobbing and weaving and enduring all the politically motivated legislation that sought to limit their numbers. China's Americans have persevered. It wasn't just the exclusion laws. There was the 1917 Immigration Act, imposed a literacy test on immigrants. If one couldn't speak English or exhibit literacy in English, they need not apply. The 1921 Emergency Immigration Act that put quotas in place and allowed the government to put their big, fat, and meaty thumb on the scale to tip it in favor of certain countries over others. Chinese got the short end of that stick, too. The 1924 Immigration Act was more of the same and put in place the national origins formula that stuck around till Beatlemania. This 1924 Immigration Act is also called the Asian Exclusion Act, so you could probably guess right away what this one was all about. Any immigrants from outside the Western Hemisphere? Well, the door for them was only left open a crack. The State Department had said back then that this was all for the best and would, quote, preserve the ideal of U.S. homogeneity, end quote. Well, no beating around the bush there. The 1952 Immigration Act put the squeeze on any suspected commies. Didn't want these guys sneaking in as immigrants. This particular immigration legislation was purely a sign of the times. Well, as I said, then came 1965. LBJ signed the Immigration and Nationality Act, and that got rid of the nations-based quota formulas and basically paved the way for what we see today. Still an imperfect union, but more culturally diverse than ever before in its history going back to 1783. And let's just leave it at this. Paper Sons and the Chinese Confession Program. If your high school American history teachers never included this, now you know. So, until the next time we meet again on the Avenue, this is Laszlo Montgomery signing off from Heart Attack and Vine. Do consider coming back again next time for another exciting episode of the China History Podcast.
Time is precious, and so are our pets. So time with our pets is extra precious. That's why we started Dutch. Dutch provides 24/7 access to licensed vets, with unlimited virtual visits and follow-ups for up to 5 pets. You can message a vet at any time and schedule a video visit the same day. Our vets can even prescribe medication for many ailments, and shipping is always free. With Dutch, you'll get more time with your pets and year-round peace of mind when it comes to their vet care.